right, good evening, everyone. So, welcome everyone to the MVS Pro Seminar. I want to acknowledge before we start a philosophy from the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee called One Dish, One Spoon, to respect the treaties and the rule of law that has been, let's say, not honored in the past as we kind of sit in this room here at the University of Toronto. This amazing kind of metaphor from this community, meaning kind of we have shared resources and one spoon should be shared amongst many people as a community. And as we look in the past and as we look to the future, I think this is a very important story for us to remember and honor and work together to make a better future. Hopefully these discussions this evening are part of that. And it is on that note, I want to bring up quickly the next talk in this lecture series, which is going to be Revital Cohen and Tur Van Balen. They're going to be speaking on March 28th. Revital, she's from Israel, and Tur is from Belgium. They live in London. Their work is quite diverse. They're looking a lot at supply chains. So they're doing everything from resource extraction in the Congo to choreographing an assembly line production in China or gambling in Macau to working with a geneticist in Japan. So I highly encourage you to come to that talk. It should be quite interesting. And then, of course, at the end of April, we'll be launching, After All, issue number 47. Again, for those of you who don't know, After All is an academic journal published by the University of Chicago Press. And the editorial board and co-publishers are Daniels here in Toronto, as well as Central St. Martin's in London, MUCA in Antwerp, and the CCA in Singapore. So we're really looking forward to that issue coming out at the end of April, and we'll have a launch here at the school with some guests to discuss the content and the participants of that. So make sure you check on the Daniels website for all of those types of information. Okay, so I'm going to quickly introduce our guests because there's a lot of material this evening that we're going to be covering. And the first guest that'll be speaking is Delia Hanna, and the second will be Nadim Saman. I've crossed their paths many times in this, I guess, several years, almost, I wouldn't say a decade, but a long time between the two of them in various places. And it's kind of really nice to have these paths all intersect here in Toronto. And to give a quick intro, Delia Hanna is currently at the Aalborg University in Copenhagen. But she did her PhD in science and aesthetics, with the philosophy of science and aesthetics at Columbia University. Tonight's kind of I wouldn't call it an informal, it's actually a proper book launch, I guess we could say. The book's just arrived. My copies came yesterday in the mail. Officially launched last night in New York, right? So we kind of got her on a plane this morning, so fortunately they weren't canceled today, so this evening could happen. And the book we'll hear about tonight, an amazing kind of project on the bicentennial of publishing of Frankenstein. So it's kind of, I'm looking forward to that a lot. Nadim, who will be also speaking, was part of the book. One of his projects is part of it. He's a curator who has co-curated the Marrakesh Biennial, Moscow Youth Biennial, several pavilions for Venice, as well as one of the, I guess you could say, the founders of the Antarctica Biennial. Yeah. So quite broad in scope, and of course was the curator at the Thyssen-Burisma or TBA 21 Foundation in the Academy, and we'll be hearing about one of his projects tonight. After they present, we're going to be having a conversation, the three of us, on stage, which will ask, of course, participation from the audience for some Q&A. We'll be kind of trying to draw out some themes, I think, on field work and other issues of the exhibition as research, as well as field work as research and writing and publishing as research, and how all of those intersect in their practices. It's really kind of a unique situation where we have a writer and philosopher and a curator who don't just sit in the institution and program excellent shows, but are actually out in the field, climbing volcanoes, scuba diving in the South Pacific, going to Antarctica on icebreakers and so forth, along with the artists as they produce the work, kind of as a first-hand experience. One of the other books that I want to kind of quickly profile is Nadim's book that also just came out. It's called As We Used to Float, in collaboration with Julien Charrier. exactly about kind of diving the South Pacific and the history of colonialism and nuclear experimentation by the U.S. military. So it's without much ado, I want to welcome our first speaker, Delia Hanna.
Thank you, Charles, and everyone for having me here. It's a great delight to be here launching this book for the second night in a row in Toronto with some of the inspiration and collaboration that's been part of the book long before I knew what to do with this idea, long before I knew whether it would turn into a book or an exhibition or an essay or an artwork. So thank you, Charles, very much for having me and for kicking off this evening with a screening of Loveland, this purple cloud that we've seen rushing over an expanse of white, a white horizon as we rolled in. I don't know if this is a film that you've seen before, perhaps. It's one that I encountered several times, and it was a mystery to me at first what it was. It was simply offered me a kind of experience of absorption in this amorphous, sometimes fearsome, sometimes romantic cloud of colorful smoke or I knew not what. So I'll say a little bit more about my obsession with being immersed in clouds and what sort of inspiration they afford as we go through the presentation. But please do bear in mind that actually Charles's purple cloud in Loveland was one of the inspirations for this project long before it took the shape that it would take today as a book. So the title of the book is A Year Without a Winter. It's published in 2018, and as Charles mentioned, that's the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein, published in 1818 by Mary Shelley. So I want to tell you a little bit about the story of how she came to write that book, because it's part of the story that's recapitulated here. So some of you may have heard the story. It's been retold with great enthusiasm over the last several years. The Frankenstein bicentennials have been celebrated around the world, and many of them have looked at the influence of this very important science fiction novel on our contemporary encounters with science, technology, emerging developments in medicine and genetics. Many people will pose the question of who the real monster is, whether it's Frankenstein or this creature he created. But what captured my attention in thinking about Frankenstein was rather learning about the environmental context in which it was written. So there's a very charming story that Shelley recounts in the 1831 edition to the novel. It was reprinted immediately many, many times over, and she was asked, how is it that a young woman of 18 could write such a horrific story about a creature assembled from inanimate parts brought to life and then would enter into this violent struggle with his creator over the course of his life? And so she recounts this story about the summer of 1816, when she had run off with her married lover, Percy Shelley, and visited Switzerland. As many fortunate British sort of elite would have the opportunity to go on the grand tour, to see the sublime sights, the Italian and Swiss Alps, a very desirable trip to take. But she recounts, in the summer of 1816, we visited Switzerland and became the neighbors of Lord Byron, who had, of course, beat them to it. At first, we spent our pleasant hours on the lake, but it proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. Some volumes of ghost stories translated from German into the French fell into our hands, and what follows is that Byron says, we will each write a ghost story, and his proposition was acceded to. So this charming episode of passing the time indoors during the interruption of a summer holiday comes to be remembered as the Dare. It was actually a fierce competition between writers, all of whom aspired to impress Byron, the renowned poet of the group. This literary competition produced a first draft of Frankenstein, Shelley recounts this experience of having a waking dream, probably partially induced by the laudanum and other things that they were drinking and smoking, and so sort of experiments that one would engage in such a summer holiday and or writers or artist retreat. She recounts a dream of a monster staring into her window and seeing him illuminated by a crack of thunder and the moonlight behind him. It also produced a very memorable vampire story called The Vampire by Lord Byron's doctor, John Polidori. By all accounts, it's a very bad story, but it was very influential on Bram Stoker in writing Dracula some 50 years later. It also produced a great deal of poetry by Shelley, by Byron, and there are many themes that are prominent in this poetry, but what was arresting for me is the prominence of environmental themes. Concerns about ice and cold, darkness, the poem that Byron wrote is called Darkness, and it imagines a world in which the sun has been darkening over time, and people realize suddenly that the sun is dying and the world is freezing, and they seek shelter in the eye of the volcano, among other places. So one can imagine that at this early stage, one begins with an inconvenient, disturbed summer holiday. They had no idea how long this episode of unseasonal weather would last. In fact, it lasted for 3 years, and the results were catastrophic. Throughout the Northern Hemisphere, it was gradually realized that this was not just a local aberration, but that all across Europe, across Russia, across the Americas, there was this period of a global climate cooling crisis. So that disturbed harvest, it produced famine, it produced social unrest, and all of the effects that would follow from such a crisis. And of course, no one knew how long it would last. And this episode came to be remembered in the British imaginary, for example, as the year without a summer. I encountered this story in an article, in fact, about public engagement with biotechnology, where the Frankenstein story is quite familiar, Frankenfish, Frankenfood, etc. And the article was titled "Public Engagement with Biotechnology Offer Lessons for Governance of Geoengineering Research and Beyond." And there the authors offer the Blythe observation. They begin with this story of Frankenstein, and they say, "This climatic disruption inspired scientific as well as literary insight." So unbeknownst to Shelley and her comrades at the time, this was no mere local phenomenon. It was actually an episode caused by a volcanic eruption half a world away on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa in 1815, the eruption of Mount Tambora, which it turns out is the largest volcanic eruption within the history of modern hominids, largely one of the largest eruptions in history, of the history of the Earth that we are aware of at this time. It spread a cloud of dust up into the stratosphere, where it would circulate by the following year around the whole world and cause this episode of cooling that would last for 3 years. Today, it also inspires ways of thinking about how we might cool our rapidly warming climate. So if you've heard anything about geoengineering practices, there's one called stratospheric injection, which actually mimics the effects of volcanoes, hopefully with a bit less, some of the consequences avoided, but of course it comes with great risks. But all of this would not be known for more than 100 years after Shelley wrote. She wrote in the midst, I imagine, of a kind of cloud, of a darkened sun, of mysterious origin, duration, and consequence. People thought the sun was dying. They thought that perhaps God had taken vengeance or was punishing people for wayward lives, etc. And there was a great deal of speculation, both scientific and cultural, and one finds this resonating throughout the literature and the artworks of the period. So it was with this in mind that A Year Without a Winter began as a project of flipping the kind of concerns of foreground and background in thinking about what Frankenstein means today. So rather than thinking about the monster story, I was interested in the way that a monstrous environment might disturb our imagination. How did that happen 200 years ago, and how might it happen today? So one looks for the traces of this kind of, excuse me, sorry, catching my breath a little bit these days. So one looks for the traces of this kind of environmental consciousness, both within the history of the writing of Frankenstein, as well as within the text itself, within the fictional space of the novel. And I found myself traveling very frequently between this fictional space and the history. The story, as recounted by Victor Frankenstein, actually begins in the Arctic, where we began this evening, when a certain Captain Walton, intent to reach the North Pole and all the glory that might bring, a polar explorer, stumbles across a half-frozen man on the ice, and they pick him up, try to bring him back to life, and find out what in the world he could possibly have been doing there, perhaps chasing an apparition that they had seen the day before. Victor, thinking that no one will believe him, finally agrees to tell his tale on his deathbed. And he says, "Prepare to hear of occurrences that are usually deemed marvelous. Were we among the tamer scenes of nature, I might fear to encounter your unbelief. But many things, perhaps even your ridicule, but many things will appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions that would provoke the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature." So I think this acquaintance with the ever-varied powers of nature, or perhaps the ever-varied powers of an environment that we ourselves are increasingly transforming, has been the central provocation of this book. An acquaintance with nature or with environments as a source of inspiration and is something that kind of fractures our imaginative capacities, perhaps opening up new utopian or dystopian visions of the world, images, stories, narratives. But I was also inspired in this project by the account of Gillian Darcy Wood, an environmental historian whose work also became a very important part of this project, because he posed a kind of thought experiment at the end of his book, Tambora, the Eruption That Shook the World. He writes in the conclusion, "On the eve of Tambora's bicentenary and facing multiplying extreme weather crises of our own, its eruption looms as the richest case study we have for understanding how abrupt shifts in climate affect societies on global scales and decadal timeframes." Excuse me. The Tambora climate crisis of 1815 to 1818 offers us a rare, clear window onto a world convulsed by weather extremes, with human communities everywhere struggling to adapt to sudden radical shifts in temperature and rainfall, and a flow-on tsunami of famine, disease, dislocation, and unrest. And these are just some of what we might imagine could take place in a period roughly imagined as a year without a winter. Taking this periodization of the Tambora era, 1815 to 1818, A Year Without a Winter as a project has run for the last 4 years, from 2015, when it was a vague idea, to 2018, when it kind of crystallized in the form of a book. But within the intervening period, it took a whole variety of forms. It took the form of an exhibition, a reenactment of the Dare that produced the series of stories 200 years ago. Now, through a commission of science fiction authors, it became exhibitions and expeditions of our own and those involved in the project to explore what I imagined as a kind of collective thought experiment, one that would have to take place across multiple media, of imagining what this period 2015 to 2018 might bring if we were to imagine it as a year without a winter. So I just want to mention briefly, actually just also is useful to remind myself what is in this book, because it's taken me all over the world and all of the disciplinary map. It includes excerpts from the literary production of the period of the Villa Diodati group, as they're known, the participants in the dare that were holed up in Lord Byron's house, the Villa Diodati, on the banks of Lake Geneva. So Byron's poem Darkness, an essay by a literary historian, David Higgins, that compares the way that that group was writing about their environmental encounters with accounts from the period of the Tambora eruption, which are quite scarce and largely derived from British and Dutch colonial authorities that were present in Indonesia at the time. So it's a kind of revisiting of the way that that historical episode was narrated. It also contains a series of excerpts from Frankenstein, mainly from the letters, the introductory and concluding letters. And I think it's quite important to attend to the framing device, which is largely centered on the kind of environmental encounters that the book contains. An essay by me called Cloud Walking, which explores my wandering into many clouds, from Loveland to clouds that traverse Tambora, Antarctica, burning palm forests in Indonesia, and many other clouds in between. I'll say a little bit more about one of the artworks by an artist named Carolina Sobecka, which was a kind of Frankenstein-like experiment upon, she kind of impersonates a geoengineer and has performed a variety of experiments. As well as an essay by an architectural historian and architect about the place that we went to re-perform the dare. Then the center section of the book, you'll see it has the look of a kind of ice cube with a strip of warm reddish sand, I like to think of it. At the center of the book is a collection of science fiction stories that were commissioned. So in a way, this book contains multiple worlds, some of them historical, some of them contemporary, some of them real, some of them fictional. And eventually, I think it becomes, or has for me at least, become a world of its own where all of those things run together. At the close of the second section of the book, and we'll hear more about tonight, worlds articulated by Nadim Saman's practice of errant curating. So I was quite fascinated by some of the exhibitions that he had done in the past, and in particular the Antarctic Biennale, which I'll say a little bit more about. And I invited him to contribute an essay on his kind of philosophy of curating, what brings curators into environments like Antarctica or nuclear landscapes, or a kind of places that are layered with historical fiction. There's a long discussion with an oceanographer who participated in the project, with Dylan Darcy Wood's notes from climbing Tambora, his first encounter with his object of with research. And one of the questions that I repeatedly asked to both to scientists, artists, historians, is this question: why go? What happens when you actually visit a place that has been the subject of your research? How does that transform the production of narratives? What does the encounter do to the knowledge that you bring to the place, and potentially, provoke questions about your grasp on the experience? And my hope in posing that question repeatedly is to elicit not only what we know about a particular place, whether it's a familiar place like home, or a historically significant place like Lake Geneva or Tambora or Antarctica, but rather what are the sorts of attitudes and modes of attention that we need to bring both to our everyday lives in order to better comprehend the environmental conditions that we're facing today. And finally, it concludes with reflections from a humanitarian worker, a Red Cross, Red Crescent worker, who became very involved in the project towards the end. And we conducted a series of sessions at the COP meeting, the climate change negotiations, using the framework of A Year Without a Winter as a way of inviting people to articulate how their environments would change. And it was quite interesting. It's quite accessible. And if we have time in the discussion, maybe we can do a little bit of that. And finally, it concludes with a series of postcards that are also reprinted in the book that recount my own return to Tambora with an artist named Julien Charrière, who Charles and Nadim and I, also have had many collaborations and relationships. They're reprinted in the book, but if you get a copy tonight, I probably have enough postcards. So that's some of the trajectories that this book has taken me through. But I'll return a little bit more to how we sought to articulate what A Year Without a Winter could be. So in preparation to repeat the dare with a group of authors commissioned to join us in the desert, we began by trying to articulate what that could mean from a scientific perspective, from a cultural perspective. Where might a story like Frankenstein come from today? It was at first obvious that we could go back to Lake Geneva and maybe even rent the Villa Diodati and all get together and kind of reenact that scenario. But it also seemed quite plausible that imagining an inverse environmental situation in a very different historical moment might be something that we'd need to do in a very different geography, in a place with a different politics. So with the collaboration of a meteorologist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the US, Melissa Borkowski, we began by seeking out a meteorological definition of A Year Without a Winter. Of course, we don't face a year without a winter. We face a future without winters, and perhaps winter is not a relevant seasonal category for all parts of the world, so perhaps it's just a proxy for a future without seasons. But nonetheless, it's useful in trying to imagine what this would look like as a place to frame a story or an image. When might this happen, and what would it do in a particular city? So Miami is already experiencing extreme sea level rise, as are many islands around the world. And if we think, when would climate change happen? When could A Year Without a Winter happen? We envisioned this initially. I collaborated, my collaborator, I should say, at Arizona State University, where this project began. Cynthia Celine was a futurist, and we envisioned this as a future scenario exercise, kind of a science fiction. And in fact, based on Melissa's calculations, for most of the cities that she did calculations based on current climate models, this would fall a period in which the year when the coldest winters become warmer than the warmest winters of the past. In other words, in which winter becomes kind of unrecognizable for that location. Those usually would happen in the third quarter of this century. However, as this project progressed, 2015, 16, 17, 18, we've actually experienced 4 out of the 5 hottest years on record. And it became increasingly clear that we could say that A Year Without a Winter, as a rhetorical framing device at the very least, has already happened in many places. So with these kinds of considerations in mind, and scientific, historical, and other collaborators, I went with a group of science fiction authors to the town of Arco Santi in the Arizona desert, which seemed a promising place to imagine a climate that was warming. Laughing, okay. It's also a place that's long been a source of inspiration for science fiction authors who have appropriated elements of Soleri's thinking for envisioning a kind of radically other ways that we might live, perhaps on other planets. In fact, Arco Santi is a kind of crumbling utopia haunted by ghosts of its own, which is part of the subject of this essay. But we envisioned it as a potentially interesting place for imagining a warming climate, and also a climate beset with its own special inconveniences, different but comparable in certain ways to those of Lake Geneva during the year without a summer. However, as is to be expected perhaps, these things never go as planned. We were instead beset by a rain cloud that arrived seemingly out of nowhere in the desert and visited us just as we sat outside to read Byron's poem Darkness by candlelight. Arachnophobia plagued us, broken ankles, and all sorts of unwelcome inconveniences, modern inconveniences like bad food. Which of course, those things are all potentially latent within the stories as well. But nonetheless, it was a provocative and inspiring experience for all of the authors and put science fiction authors into conversation with oceanographers, with climate scientists, with historians, and those stories are recounted in this section. We read last night with Tobias Buckell from this amazing story, A World to Die For, which is set in multiple worlds that have followed different IPCC protocols. So if you have a high, good expectations about the outcomes of what will happen as a consequence of climate change, that some of those worlds are imagined in science fiction stories as are far more dystopian worlds. For example, but from this initial project of commissioning a series of science fiction stories, the genre in which Shelley herself wrote and is indeed described as a founder, we also had to confront another question, which is if the novel was the kind of quintessential 19th century aesthetic form in which a very memorable response to an environmental crisis could be had, what might be the relevant media form today? So we have the possibility of a geographical displacement, but also a displacement or a kind of inversion or transformation of this historical episode into other aesthetic media and other forms. So that took the form of exhibitions, for example, with Carolina Sebeka, who performed a series of experiments on a cloud and an air pump, reconstructing historical clouds that have changed the world, from Tambora to dry ice to geoengineering clouds that are currently potentially underway in field experiments in Arizona and elsewhere. And so this figure of the experimenter returned, a figure that's also potentially a figure that contemporary artists embody. I'll just simply jump from one image to another to say it was just after exhibiting this work that I happened to find myself in New York at the Armory show, going around, seeing what was out there, kind of taking a break and enjoying an exhibition that someone else had curated, when I stumbled across this piece, which all of a sudden really captivated my attention, because in some ways it had a quality that was always at the back of my mind in thinking about what this project could mean, what A Year Without a Winter could mean. And imagining a time in which something that is a source of great inconvenience, for example today, ice on the wings of a plane or on my boots as I slip through the streets, might become something so rare and so precious that I would miss it. I would see it the way I now look forward to the first blooming of a crocus in the spring. And I remembered my own childhood experiences, putting my hands on the window of there would be ice crystals on the window in Quebec in the winter when I visited family there. And they were so precious, and as soon as you touched them, they would of course melt. But as luck would have it, huge exhibition, I couldn't find the label, the tag, so I took a picture of the piece and thought, well, maybe I'll track it down eventually. Wouldn't that be nice? A few weeks later, I was fortunate enough to receive a last-minute invitation from Nadim Saman to join the Antarctic Biennale, a project that I had been eagerly tracking, wishing to be a part of, wishing I had thought to curate myself for the whole duration of the project, and I was absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to join this project in order to review it for an art magazine. And it struck me suddenly that although I hadn't planned this project and it wasn't my sort of curatorial mandate to put it into the book, the fact that this would happen, a biennale in Antarctica, an art project, an exhibition project, and actually really a very experimental art project, in 2017, right in the middle of my project, seemed to fit perfectly that an Antarctic Biennale would happen during this period that I was increasingly imagining as a year without a winter. And so, immersed as I was in this kind of fictional space, I started to imagine myself as Captain Walden, entering the novel itself, and thinking about how, at the opening scenes of Frankenstein, he's drawn to the pole. Of course, he's drawn to the North Pole with dreams of glory. And even still, it's a kind of fraught form of desire that he expresses. He says, "I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is a seat of frost and desolation. It presents itself to my imagination as a region of beauty and delight." And this is, of course, one of the problems with environments like Antarctica, which we might all want to visit, and yet if we do, we will just contribute to destroying it more and more quickly. So just a few days after the Larsen ice shelf was announced, there was a huge crack, and we wondered if it would break off. I was lucky enough to get aboard the ship. And I'll just show a few slides, which maybe Nadim will say more about if you ask him. Needless to say, they were extremely provocative, from performance art to installation, music, installations aboard the ship as well as aboard land. I like to show this image because it's such a provocation. Perhaps you know the story of Shackleton's visit to Antarctica, which is called The Endurance. This is certainly a work of endurance art and a kind of play with masculine fantasies of penetrating the unknown white space. There's no possibility of visiting Antarctica with a group of artists without raising a whole host of provocations, and it was an absolute delight to be able to think through that within this current moment, to think about what we're doing there, what sort of exposure and awareness that cultivates, and how we might think about the relation between the environments we inhabit on a daily basis and the distant effects of our daily life on environments like this. Again, a frozen plant, or a plant encased in an icy landscape presented it to me. Projection screens for fantasies. And it turned out that I would meet the artist who had created the frozen plant, Julien Charrière. So this was a kind of impossibly fortuitous meeting. And it actually led to one of the culminating aspects of the project. So after Antarctica, which was, of course, emerged as an important geographical and media displacement, potentially, for this project, it occurred to me only in the last hours that, of course, there was one site that demanded further attention, namely Tambora, the volcano that had figured in the story up until that point more as a character in the story than a real geographical location, a place with its own ecology, its own culture, its own politics, its own economic considerations. And when I realized, in a way, that I had only been engaging with Tambora as a causal force in a story, a scientific story, and then in this case, a cultural story, I realized in a way what this project was about. It was a kind of invitation to reorient myself with respect to this imaginative geography, both historical and contemporary. It was very fortuitous that Julien happened to receive a commission for a work commemorating a flood that had taken place in Switzerland in 1818, caused by this climate cooling crisis, in which a glacier got so big that a glacial lake behind it formed and overflowed. And he got in touch and he said, does that have something to do with that volcano you were talking about? And we realized, yes, of course it does. And we returned finally to Sumbawa to the town of Doropeti, which is where we began our climb. And our first stop was at the Tambora monitoring station, where we spent the night and visited with the scientists who would climb the mountain with us. We were surprised that this volcano, which had been monitored by, which had been the source of the largest eruption in history, was monitored by a small old seismograph that lives in a suitcase, transmitting data to Indonesia's extremely busy volcanic hazards monitoring station. This volcano is one among many, doesn't get as much attention as you would think it would, considering how prominent it had been in this narrative. So that was our kind of the first realization that we had not appreciated the significance of this space within its local context. So over the course of several days, we set off over the landscape of Tambora. Our walk began like this with a car ride. It quickly became like this, and we ended up on foot, moving for what seemed like an eternity through a fog that was cold and damp, and we in fact wondered, it was so dense that we wondered if we would just fall right into the crater if and when we ever reached the top, based on there's very little tourist infrastructure there, although there has been some that's been set up in the last few years as a consequence of this 200th anniversary. There have been celebrations and commemorations there as well. But at a certain point, I realized that this experience of being lost in the fog, I had returned to one of the sources of inspiration for the project. And in fact, when we reached the top of the mountain, the fog cleared in a wall, and we realized that it was the heat coming from the volcano still that creates this wall of fog, and it was completely magical to emerge on the other side of it. In a way, the landscape is so bare, it almost seems as if this eruption happened very recently. But we did wonder what we were seeing, how much of that was an effect of the volcano and how much of it was an effect of what's happened around the area ecologically ever since. It turned out when we woke up the next morning that it was Indonesian Independence Day, and we were not alone on the rim of the crater. But it seemed a very special day with this wall of fog. So moving through the crater and back down, we wondered what we were going to do with this experience. And we had fairly limited ability to communicate with our guides, but we were doing our best and Google translating and et cetera, and bringing along what we had read. And there we learned that the name Tambora can be translated in the local language as an invitation to disappear, which is just a kind of evocative name, and we wondered if it had meant that the mountain had appeared and disappeared behind a cloud, or whether it had rather disappeared up into the sky in a cloud of dust that would have shrouded the whole world in cold and darkness for 3 years. But as we meditated on that, returning down the mountain, preparing to leave the island, actually what we saw were scenes much more like this. If you've ever seen scenes like this is an oil palm plantation, and they stretch for miles and miles and miles in Indonesia and through much of Southeast Asia, as well as increasingly through South America. And we've probably all heard about some of the effects of this, massive deforestation, loss of habitat for animals, etc. Consumption of palm oil is one of the major drivers of climate change, of emissions from those regions, as well as other environmental and social catastrophes. So in thinking about, and of course this was the scene that we encountered very regularly on our drives back to the airport. And so thinking about what this might mean, this became an inspiration for a new project by Shahriar that he completed last year, which is a film set in an oil palm plantation, and the title is An Invitation to Disappear. I would have loved to play it tonight, but I'm already over time, so I'll just show a few stills. A kind of mysterious scene Again, we return into a cloud, often purple, pink, red, sometimes ominous, sometimes seductive. I'll tell you what it is. It's a party, a rave party, set in a palm oil plantation with a pounding techno beat that rises over the course of an hour-long film and loops, much like Loveland, kind of drawing us in, seducing us with a mystery, perhaps offending us with the crassness of the prospect of partying in the palm oil plantation, except no one is there. And an invitation to disappear came to re-signify this experience of, or this kind of awareness of our absent presence in landscapes that are far from our awareness and perhaps geographically distant, places where we are have enormous effect, but are not necessarily aware of it in a personal and a bodily way. And it's hard to say how we would react, how we would care, how we would behave differently if we were more conscious of what it actually takes to extract this delicious oil that melts in your mouth, in your Nutella, in your snacks. And we might wonder, how is it possible that we could think about having a party in the kind of grave of Anthropocene landscapes? In fact, this is something that we're doing all the time. But one of the questions we kept asking ourselves as we worked through this project, and I returned with Shahryar to film this project, spent 3 weeks in an oil palm plantation, also full of interesting inconveniences. But as we thought about this question, where is the party? We were always coming back to the matter that actually it's right here. It's in our cookies, it's in our vending machines. And it's this kind of production of an awareness of a relationship between disparate places, disparate historical moments that has continued to fascinate me throughout this project, has fascinated me about Nadim's curatorial practices, some of Charles's artworks, and of course my collaborations with Julian. I'll just close by saying one of the outcomes of this project, as I wondered what sort of artworks, stories, images might be produced during A Year Without a Winter, this project bled into another one, and this set of postcards narrates our experiences and kind of beginning to dream what this encounter with Tambora and its adjacent landscapes might mean, but that story is told elsewhere in a volume called in the catalog for An Invitation to Disappear, and also very excitingly on an LP record, a techno record, which Julian released with Ed Inland, a DJ based in Berlin, on Aton Records, the Berghain label. It's just cool and wonderful, and also far more political than one might initially imagine, thinking about what a techno album might mean. So it led us into another artwork, into other landscapes, landscapes that are perhaps more symptomatic, as well as causes of what A Year Without a Winter could be. So it's a story that continues to unfold, and it has there are methodological considerations as well as very specific questions about landscapes and our experience of a kind of immersions in landscapes affected by climate change and the cultural politics thereof. And I look forward to talking more about that. Sorry, I'm a little over time, so let me turn this over to Nadim to talk about how else and where else one might expand the environmental imaginary through curatorial practice.
Well, thank you, Charles, for having me. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Delia, for that incredible sort of multifaceted presentation. I really admire the sort of symmetry of the project, but also the space it leaves for spontaneity. And when you talk about these interconnections of people, this project really brought quite a lot of people together in very serendipitous ways and the, keeping an eye on how a work can emerge from a chance encounter, I always find to be an important and inspiring part of sort of doing this. This is kind of the reason to do it in a way. I'm reminded of a phrase or a quote by André Breton that I read in his book, The Lost Steps, which I lost actually. And it's something like we don't write to publish. We publish to find men. And I mean to say women too, or to find each other. And that's kind of my vibe for Valentine's Day as we go forward into this evening. And so, Valentine's Day, and it's cold outside, and I was originally going to speak about Antarctica, but Delia does a better job of speaking about that project than I do. So I'd like to talk about somewhere tropical and warm your hearts before you go out. Treasure of Lima, a buried exhibition. This is the project that I presented sort of shortly afterwards, after it had happened in Copenhagen. That's where I met Delia. So we met at the end of that talk, and the collaboration spread from there. So I think that when you really put your heart into your work, or if you really follow an idea, there's no telling where it'll lead and who you will meet. And Rita, I married her. So that's my Valentine. So I want to speak today about the limits of exhibition making. What can it achieve, or what can it be beyond the walls of the gallery or museum? And why ask this question? We don't need to renovate the format of exhibitions just for the sake of novelty, but we might need to do so in order to reconfirm that art is not merely decoration, illustration, distraction, or a completed equation. When we reimagine the exhibition, we fight for the power, the joy, and the potential in this incredible multi-generational game that we call the history of art. The field of play today contains so many institutions, audiences, discourses, media, and markets. When we truly reimagine the exhibition, we can reimagine these too, through the very constitution of our projects. And we can reimagine what their value might be outside what we have come to describe as the art world. So let's imagine the current setup, or the state of play, as a set of images of what the possibilities for art are, or where the competencies of exhibition making begin and end. Let us imagine these images as golden trophies or jealously guarded jewels. Let us imagine that we are invited to look but not touch at all these sparkling diamonds. Let us imagine that we are expected to let them shine in display cases, on auction blocks, in textbooks, or laid out in audience development plans. And those of you who work in museums may be aware of these things. That we must leave it up to their present owners to decide how best to dispose of this capital, that is, the potential of what art can be or do. Boring, I say. Why not lay our grubby hands on these images and carry them off to whereabouts unknown? Perhaps Antarctica, perhaps up a volcano, perhaps into the bed of a stranger who turns out to be important to you. Why not exhibit what else these images can do? Let's unlock their potential to shape the world around us. Diamonds can be used to cut stone, after all. Which is to say, there's a surplus of value in the images of what art and exhibitions are today that needs to be redistributed, perhaps even spent recklessly. We must be hackers or pirates. That's a Jolly Roger. And we must go a-voyaging. Not voyaging, I should say, in pursuit of distraction. Rather, because beyond the images of art today, there is a sea of representations of nature, technology, society, government, that need reinterpreting, replacing, rescoring, or better yet, exhibiting, re-exhibiting, if we are to cope with the challenges of living together on this earth with 7 billion people. So I'd like to now present an act of curatorial piracy, and I want to tell you about a project called Treasure of Lima, a buried exhibition, and it is, as the second part of the title indicates, an exhibition that was buried. And it was buried on an island, and that island is Cocos Island. It's 500 nautical miles off the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. It belongs to Costa Rica. It's a national park. It's uninhabited, apart from 5 park rangers. And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's actually the island you see in the opening sort of shot in Jurassic Park when they fly in the helicopter to this island. It's just a steaming, seething jungle with sort of, waterfalls everywhere. It's primordial. But it's not just that. It is the original treasure island, which is to say, it is an island, almost like it's the text of an island in which treasure is supposedly buried. It's the foundation of various historical myths around it. For example, David Davis's treasure, Pirate Edward Davis, who sacked the Pacific coast of South America in the 1680s, is reputed to have buried his hoard there. Benito of the Bloody Sword, in the early 1800s, sacked coastal settlements in Pacific Central America. And he, too, it is said, buried treasure on Cocos Island, including tens of millions of dollars worth of gold taken from a Spanish bullion ship. 350 tons of gold raided from Spanish ships by the 19th century British pirate Captain Bennet Graham are also reputed to be held there. And most famous of all, the so-called treasure of Lima. Now that is a treasure that was more or less the crown jewels, if you want, or the sort of like the Fort Knox of the Spanish Viceroyalty of Peru, which was held in Lima. When it became under threat by Simon Bolivar's army, this hoard, which contained 113 gold religious statues, 1 life-size Virgin Mary, 200 chests of jewels, 273 swords with jeweled hilts, 1,000 diamonds, solid gold crowns, 150 chalices, and hundreds of gold and silver bars. This is the reported hoard. It was entrusted to the care of one of their key mercenaries, Captain William Thompson, who was instructed to put it on board his ship, with chaperones, of course, and sail it to Panama so that they could defend the city, so that the hoard wouldn't be taken by the approaching army. Well, he did sail off into the sunset, but the chaperones, the soldiers and the monks that were accompanying him, in fact, washed up onto a few beaches with their throats slit, and Thompson and the treasure of Lima had gone AWOL. Well, they were tracked down. They were found. All of the sailors on the ship were put to the rack, to unspeakable Spanish tortures, and asked, what happened? Where is it? And they all, to a man, told them, we went to an island, off the coast, some many miles away, called Cocos Island, and we buried it there. And then they promptly executed all of them, but kept the captain, Thompson, and his first mate, and said, you'll take us to this island. Now, this island's far enough offshore that it's not on the kind of main route. It can't be spotted. It sort of was always a place for pirates and whalers to stop for water. This is a painting of Cocos Island. This is one of the only 2 places you can sort of anchor a ship with any degree of sort of protection from the elements. So anyway, when they got onto the shore, and they said, show us, Thompson and his first mate managed to run off into the jungle and hide, and they couldn't be found. It's this really thick jungle. It's really impenetrable. And so after looking for them for a while, eventually, or for some days, perhaps even weeks, they gave up, and they went back, and the treasure was not found. However, Thompson and his first mate eventually were picked up by a whaling ship from Newfoundland. And Thompson ended his days in a home for old mariners in Newfoundland, where he was attended by a sort of helpful, sort of younger, sort of, I'm a member of the staff, like an orderly, who, was giving him good care. And Thompson said, well, in his deathbed sort of thing, you've been very good to me, you've really taken care of me, and I really want to thank you for that. Have you perhaps ever heard of the treasure of Lima? And then the young Canadian sort of orderly said, no, I haven't. Thompson said, well, let me tell you about it. And I am that Captain William Thompson, and here is a map, young man. You can have it. Now, sounds like a story, sounds like a movie, sounds like a novel. It would become one. It is the absolute basis of these stories. It really set off, in a big way, a sort of treasure hunting mania. This young orderly eventually got investors, went to Cocos Island to look for it. And there were, for a time, in the sort of the 1800s, speculative investment was getting up enough capital to get charter a ship and go to some of these islands on the basis of very strange and bogus maps to try and dig up these chalices and gold Virgin Marys. And it was reading about a returned party of treasure hunters who had failed to discover the treasure of Lima in a San Francisco newspaper that inspired one Robert Louis Stevenson to write a certain book called Treasure Island. So I'm bringing this to you because it's another book inspiring another project. It's kind of narrative and reality. They come together in a way. And they sort of inspired madness. This is a man called August Gistler, who was the heir to a knife-making sort of dynasty in some kind of regional part of Germany, who decided to leave everything and sort of live on this island with his wife, or rather first petitioned the leader of Costa Rica, the first leader, to make him the mayor of it. He said, I'll set up a colony there. It'll become economically productive if you'll grant me the rights to what's there. And he just incessantly dug tunnels. The colonists who left provincial Germany with the hopes of a tropical life on this island, eventually they found they couldn't grow potatoes in the sweltering soil. They kind of all left, like on the whaling ships and post boats, but he stayed behind. And he just dug tunnels. So this is really that island, and here's one of Gistler's tunnels that crisscross part of the island. Well, it's a long story, of course, but when I began to work for a foundation called Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Contemporary, which had a specific platform or program that had to do with bringing artists to sea, and specifically had an interest in the sort of Pacific coast of Central America. And I was looking for a sort of a site that may be more specifically interesting than others. I said, well, geez, shouldn't we go to Treasure Island? And that was the birth of this kind of idea. Usually it begins with a very sort of crude inspiration, and then from there it kind of snowballs and more things happen. So what I did was I commissioned works by all the artists you see here, and instead of digging for treasure on Treasure Island, I asked the Costa Rican National Park Service for permission to bury a treasure. And I commissioned this exhibition architecture by Aranda Lash to architects, US architects. You might call it it's exhibition architecture, also treasure chest perhaps. And I asked artists for works, and my pitch to all these very eminent characters was, give me a work of art, I'm going to dig a hole and bury it, and no one will see it, and you'll never get it back again. And wouldn't you know it, that was a more kind of interesting proposition to many of these figures than asking to display it on a wall. So they agreed. And so here's the chest. This is a stainless steel sort of outer shell, sort of about this big, which is a kind of shock absorber in a way, and it sort of protects this kind of pearl, if you want, in the inside, which is a glass pressure sphere. It's a vacuum-sealed sphere that's normally used to send cameras to the ocean floor, and a series of housings. One over there is sort of LP, holds LP records. Another kind of tube works on paper. These smaller boxes, small-scale sculptures, and one of which a hard drive. So we worked really hard with Aranda Lash on the conservation conditions of this sort of archive or sort of exhibition space or collection. And here's what it looks like when it's put together. This is us sort of sealing it and sort of checking the gauge to make sure there's no air or moisture inside, and then off we went. This is arriving in Cocos. You see the landscape, exceedingly rugged. It's Treasure Island come to life. Nothing else to say. There's more than 200 waterfalls. It's like a plateau of cliff, and the waterfalls just fall off the side. And then the middle of it is this thick jungle. But on the shore, when you arrive on the shore, there's no pier, you kind of have to swim to shore, there are all these stones just right on the beach, and they're carved by whalers and pirates who've left their mark behind. So you can see these from 1843, probably mostly whalers, but And then, of course, Cousteau couldn't help but leave his mark too. So there's a sense in which this island is sort of overlaid with this incredible history and this kind of romance, if you want, this historical romance, and it's these legends of buried treasure. But it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site for the sheer abundance of marine life around the island, and also on land, endemic species. And it's home to some of the greatest concentrations of sharks in the whole Pacific. Hammerheads, tiger sharks, Galapagos sharks, silkies. It's really an extremely important place for sharks. Here is a tiger shark that I met. So this is exhibition installation. We had permission to bury it on this island. People are not allowed to go on this island whatsoever. You can go there on a diving charter, perhaps, but you'll always remain anchored offshore somewhere. So this sort of entry into the island is its own kind of required a lot of permission. And of course, we didn't want to pick an obvious place, so we thought we'd try to bring it through the most difficult part of the island. And this is exhibition installation here. That's the captain of our boat. My only regret with this project is wearing those board shorts. I mean, it didn't curate my outfit properly. So off we go, and sort of climb it up into the canopy, and eventually you have to find a cave. And if you've got to find a cave and you're going to dig a hole to bury something, at least make the patron who commissioned it dig the hole. So that is the Archduchess Baron Francesca von Habsburg digging a hole. And thank God that we can sometimes make these collectors work for the art. So this is burial, and it gets covered up. And then left there in the secret location. Okay, so far, so much boys' own adventure. Next step, we take the GPS coordinates of this buried exhibition, and I entrusted them to a Dutch artist named Constant Dullard. He's from the net art scene. He's very interested in surveillance and sort of information security. And he worked with IT security consultant to encrypt the coordinates. So those simple few digits that amounted to its precise location became a cipher of 8,000 characters in length. I'm sorry for the resolution. And that cipher was 3D printed as a steel scroll, which you see here, and set within a second version of the chest and brought to auction in New York and sold for 200,000 euros to a collector. But the collector doesn't get the key to decrypt it. So they've bought an unreadable map to an exhibition on an island that it's illegal for them to visit. And of course, the question is why? And what did we do with this money? What we did was we used it to set up a shark research and conservation initiative for the sharks that swim around the island to discover where do they go, what do they do. And this is new data that has just come out November last year. It was our first data collection. And we've discovered that the sharks of Cocos Island actually range as far as the shores of Colombia. Sharks are some of the most little studied of ocean species for obvious reasons. They've been hated for a long time. It's only recently, we're only starting to learn about their behavior, their migratory practices, and their importance in the ocean ecosystem. So this kind of provision of visibility for the sharks of Cocos is a kind of like direct material outcome of this project, which had a lot to do with hiding things. Now, I'm not sure how much time I have. Charles, 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 5? Delia, you overran. Well, I wanted to unpack this box that's still tightly sealed. But I guess the thing I want to say is that, firstly, this project sort of hijacks the maritime dimensions of Central American history and its pirate element to compare modes of value and methods of identification in the present. So, also at a time when many people are concerned with privacy, surveillance, and data protection, It also highlights secrecy as a matter of performance, that is, subject to the rule of desire and the politics of access and exclusion. When I talk about the rule of desire and the politics of access and exclusion, there's an important question, which is, what has this collector bought? Have they bought a collection of work? Well, not really. They don't have it in hand. We've sold them an object. There's no bill of sale that says they own the objects on Cocos. They haven't seen them. Have they bought the right to recover these works in any way? Well, no, it's illegal for them to set foot on Cocos. Have they bought a tool that would allow them to trump, as it were, the legal niceties and just go for it anyway? If they can crack the code and they've got the resources to buy something like this on a whim in an auction, they probably have the resources to charter a boat and get some pirates together and just go do it for sport on the weekend. Well, do they want to do that? Have they bought this tool, as it were, in order to enact that, or have they bought into the idea that perhaps this exhibition should never be seen, should never be sort of accessed, that perhaps the value of the project or what is being exhibited is the island as a kind of treasure, as a natural resource, or as a space of sort of ecological regulation? Do they value the regulative space of the island? Are they a pirate or a steward, in a sense? And we offer that kind of sort of as a public performative opportunity. We've created a sort of performance element for the collector in which they can choose to sort of in a way open or close the exhibition. I tend to think that this exhibition might be closed the minute the box gets opened. And if it indeed got opened, it would announce a few other things. It would announce that the regulations prohibiting access to this island have somehow either been abolished or aren't good enough, because they can be sort of overrun by someone with the right resources and will. So what we've done is, by hiding all this art, we've also made visible as I say, the regulation, the value of the regulatory framework, and we've, in a sense, sort of offered a dare to the National Park of Costa Rica to live up to this challenge of enticement that we've sort of thrown out there into the world like a kind of crafty story. We've also affected, I think, productive misfiling in the historical archive, which is to say, we named the project Treasure of Lima a buried exhibition. So we gave it the same name as the most famous buried treasure on that island. When you search now for treasure, and with regards to Cocos Island, or when you search for buried treasure there, as well as coming across gold-plated Virgin Marys and bejeweled swords, you have to confront, at least in terms of the way the Google algorithms work, a conversation about biodiversity, about sort of regulation of space for sort of ecological viability. You have to encounter a conversation about economic power and whether power sort of what the value of that is, let's say the relationship between the price of everything and the value of it, really. So all these things we sort of, and so also the importance of protecting information, and perhaps the pleasures of kind of cracking things open, but also, as I say, the importance of protecting things. So this is a kind of, this is all affected by not showing art. And yet it was an art exhibition, and yet there were 40 artworks, and they were deployed, and they were installed in the world. They were installed in some sense, physically in a hole in the ground, but they were also buried within, or installed within this kind of narrative, the narrative dimensions of this place, the historical sort of narrative dimension. They were installed within the kind of economic nexus of this place. On the one hand, sort of at least sort of geeing up a little bogeyman of a potential invader, and at the same time resourcing this conservation project, which there were no resources for before. And a few other things besides. But also, it's installed in the media space of this island. For example, no one could come and see this exhibition. No one could come see us dig the hole. It's all in the story. Everything about this action consists in the documentation and how it moves through the world, or where you deploy it, and what kind of conversation it can start, and or even what sort of real things it can move around and touch. So I like this kind of thing. I think this is a kind of layered approach to site specificity. It's not just about the physicality of it. It's also, of course, there's a narrative dimension, but then you can take it all the way up. When you pick a site, you say, what is this place? And you kind of sort of try to cut it into sections, and then ask, as a curator, how can you rescore each of these spaces? How can your project be a vector through all those layers of site, that where it touches each layer, it shifts the scene a little bit, or it kind of reorders the space, if you want. I'm using a kind of spatial analogy. Every place the project touches, I want to rearrange, at least within the kind of universe of this project. So that's kind of my approach to site-specific curating. Time's up. Thank you. I hope we'll have a good discussion. Happy Valentine's Day.
Where should I go?
Great. Just leave that image up there.
Yeah. That's great.
Thank you both for the presentations tonight. Maybe we'll start kind of, since you're fresh on the palette, we'll like kind of have a quick question for Nadine that I think will draw both of you in, and we'll kind of come back, I think, to the first presentation. I mean, I've always kind of seen the curatorial work you do as kind of an agent provocateur. I mean, when I invited you here, I was like, you're about to enter the heart of decolonial discourse of Toronto, and I was very interested to hear how stories about treasure hunting and expeditions, working with foundations from Russian oligarchs to Franziska von Habsburg and so on, are interesting people to work with. They're interesting foundations to work with. They play a certain part in history. And so I'm wondering always how you kind of navigate that, moving from project to project. I mean, you really closed the last one with the nice aspect of paradox of, when the chest opens, the exhibition closes, to articulate that. Because so many of the projects I find on a surface level seem to really go head in to really problematic territory, whether they're colonial past or scientific things gone awry. All of these kinds of things in both your projects, really. So how do you navigate kind of being these agent provocateurs, either yourselves as curators or writers, or working with artists who are like that? I mean, this is a good case study, but is this something you're engaging with often? Do you have to kind of solve that problem each time you go into it? Do you ever get worried you're going to get caught on the image of the artwork, even though I know you started the presentation saying it's not decorative or illustrative, and you want this kind of depth and social aspect and political aspect? Does that tension kind of fail, or maybe if you could explore those a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and of course the most relevant one of all. As someone who works in very different places all the time, I'm ranging from Russia and Kazakhstan to Bikini Atoll to Berlin or the like. I think I've come to understand that contexts are always they're not sort of monochrome in their sort of social, political, and economic makeup. I mean, the connection between the public and private powers that be in any one place might even look a certain way when they're described to you in a a map of like how the society works. But the facts on the ground are often different. It's often the person you're speaking to then and now who kind of can open up an opportunity for a deeper collaboration or something more meaningful. For example, Antarctica, you mentioned funded by a Russian oligarch. Well, that sounds definitely like a bogeyman. As a matter of fact, we collaborated with the Russian Institute of Oceanography, which is the main sort of oceanographic sort of institution of that country, and they gave us one of their one of their polar research fleet ships at cost for this project. And we brought scientists from Russia and internationally on board as well. And the price of the fuel was paid by Eugene Kaspersky, who is he is a very rich man, but he has an IT company. I think the question of what is the public realm, what is the private realm, and how do they come together in art projects is the same for museums around the world as well. But I also think that nobody wants art really in a place that's difficult. They don't. I mean, the people running these places, the sort of institutions that are stewards of them, they very rarely want anyone there who's going to rock the boat or sort of shine a light or on something, or they sort of, nobody's asking for a more kind of a skewed take on who they are or what this place is or how to reorganize its communication. And I think that the provocation is that art is there at all. When I ask about a place like Cocos Island, which is fascinating to everyone, it's in our imaginary as, it's Treasure Island. As soon as you know that, you go, wow, that's fascinating. And you learn that nobody lives there and that it's kind of off limits. I ask, well, what is the relationship between that fact and that fascination and the things I care about in my cultural activity and agency? How could art ever matter to a place like that? What could art ever be in relation to a place which is just a home for sharks? And in trying to just kind of step by step draw a line in my mind between them, I think we can create a new relation between art and this place, and a relation that has kind of endowed a conservation initiative, amongst other things. So everything's always connected, as Delia said. I think geographical distance often belies functional proximity. Mm-hmm. The first part I'll leave, but I think I'll stick with the second part of my statement.
I mean, and the version of that, I guess, Delia, I wanted to hear about from you. What became apparent in your talk tonight, more than ever, I think, is kind of the existential aspect of the way you do work. I mean, I remember our first conversation years ago, learning about, academic research and the history of science and, the existential aspect of pregnancy tests through frog tests or something, and your real kind of willingness to kind of look at how our scientific methods are related to an academic process and not necessarily treating the subject-object relation that's been through modernism and science as something that has to be maintained, and really diving into engaging with the material. And this became apparent tonight, I think, in the sense of okay, what's community in the writing? What is that history? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of very existential methodology of writing and looking at things.
Thanks for making that connection. I hadn't really made it myself. I'll say two things. One is that in the intervening period, I think, since I finished my PhD and started figuring out what I like to do, I've encountered this term called field philosophy, and I thought, oh yeah, that fits. I can wear that hat. Field philosophers that don't stay in the library, but kind of go out into some field where they're often the only philosopher and wonder what constitutes a field to begin with, and what they're doing there, and often try to make that legible in some way, full of frustrations. But it also often means putting oneself very personally and bodily into kind of research questions, environments, historical episodes that are uncomfortable. And I wanted to follow up a little bit on the question that you raised. I guess when you reminded me of that, a few years ago reenacted with a group of scholars a historical pregnancy test that had involved using frogs to perform pregnancy tests the way it was done in the 1930s. the frogs don't die, but it's certainly an ethically uncomfortable thing to do. It's much easier to pee on a stick and, this kind of keep that distance from animal bodies and other people being involved in finding out what some sort of condition of the world or one's own body might mean and how it might be mediated by other creatures. I hadn't thought about that as being similar to what I've been up to lately, but I guess I'm quite drawn to research practices, artworks, curatorial practices that take us into uncomfortable territory. And that's become increasingly, the importance of doing that something I explore in this book, especially with respect to climate change or other exhibitions I've curated about the Anthropocene and its cognate terms. I think that it's really important to become more clear about what's going on with climate change, et cetera, to mobilize people to care more about it. But actually, when I think about it, what I realize is that I actually know a lot about it, and I think a lot of people have enough information at their fingertips and enough comprehension at their fingertips. But what I lack, and I think maybe others share that with me, is a kind of imaginative comprehension and orientation within that reality on a day-to-day basis. And when I start to think through that, I find no comfortable position. I can't get out of bed, eat my breakfast, go to work, pay my bill, check my email without becoming completely imbricated in very problematic systems, my single-use plastic, my palm oil and my peanut butter, et cetera, et cetera. If you open your eyes to how you're oriented within these complex, entangled environmental, geographical, historical, political situations, there becomes really no comfortable resting place from which to have your opinions about the way things ought to be cohere with where you live and how you live, even with what sort of images or environments you're drawn to. So I'm very provoked in my thinking and therefore attracted, not so much because I liked the idea of digging in another old colonial hole or spending a week, 3 weeks filming in a palm oil plantation. But those are spaces that are thought-provoking for me in a way that a chart that shows me something I already know in bright colors that isn't. I think that I want to bring forward and kind of put myself in situations that provoke me to think about how I am embedded in, as Nadim says, these kind of multiple layers and vectors, and kind of sit with my relationship, with my complicity, and try to imagine something, how an improvement could be made from that position, rather than a kind of bird's eye view where I know what I think and I know how I'd like the world to be.
To pick up on that, I think you have to dive deep, in a sense. So in the case of this project, it's not like we just gave the money to someone. We had to design a kind of a methodology for like a project that would be valid for this place. And so we convened a symposium in USC of marine biologists and specific shark behavior experts, specifically to debate what do we need to know, like what kind of visibility do we want from these creatures in this ecosystem that we don't have. And so the exhibition or the project design didn't end with the shiny facets of the box. It went right the way through to diving. For the first time in my life, I qualified in a pool and then hit this. So you have to actually look it in the eye and then follow it through intellectually into a space beyond art, into a kind of space of kind of science and conservation. And that is like staying with the problem, that's diving deep into it. So this, I think the tension between the surface and the depth of a project is interesting. And the oscillation between the two is what keeps it kind of interesting a lot of the time. Starting with a cliche like Treasure Island, you think, okay, yeah, it's a cliche, but these sort of these geographical figures that are like part of the mental furniture of like how we imagine that part of the world, like the oceanographic realm. My next project after this was a trip to Bikini Atoll with Julian Charrière, and I wrote a book about attempting to make a film there. But remember, Bikini Atoll, it gives us the name for the most ubiquitous piece of swimwear associated with like bucolic, unproblematic coastal sort of island experiences. And in fact, it's the name of a displaced people, you know? And when you look up, when you've got bikini in Microsoft Word autocorrect, you know, but you don't have bikinian, you know? So that's something we work through in that project as well. Just, you know, the island as a kind of the good as a geographical figure, and attempting to kind of work through or unground it. I think starting from the surface and the cliche, these sort of like readily tradable tokens, like this schlock, if you want, and then kind of spinning them through a sphere of concerns that are more relevant is kind of interests me.
Mm. I mean, both of you, you're both incredible writers, quite beautiful in the sense of how this book at least is pulling together an amazing spectrum. I mean, that's also kind of what's amazing about both of you is there's nothing really that is not brought into the projects, from economics and the art market to science to geopolitical issues, and that's a continual theme for all of them. And the writing really pulls that together, and you're the winner, and then the fictional writing that you've kind of been doing in the Float book. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk, you know, not so much just about exhibition making or these kind of political ways that art works within a larger sphere than just the art world, but actual writing itself and how you approach that within your practices.
Delia.
I have to say that I've had to really learn to write in a new way, or maybe to begin with, in order to keep track of the way that I think. I tend to actually think in images, and figuring out how to put them one after another into writing is actually been the most difficult thing I've had to do in my professional development. Way back in my education, I was a science student, and I wrote scientific articles, and later as a philosopher I read about how writing a scientific article is actually a process of reconstructing an experiment, for example, as if you had done it in the order that you should have done it once you realized what was going to happen. But I thought, as a young chemistry student, that actually happened, and I found that process of kind of reconstructing the order of images, of thoughts, a kind of constellation of ideas into some sort of narrative. It's enormously challenging, and I think that's why I was especially drawn to Charles's work. Not only this film, this was the way I first encountered your work, a cloud that rushes over and over and plays on a loop with as only the kind of narrative is produced in part by the musical development of the piece. But then later, when we met, I learned more about this project, that it was the film was paired with an excerpt from a novel where a story of a purple cloud is told, a kind of, actually a novel that we may not have time for this story, but bears a striking resemblance to the episode of Tambora and Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's life. It's actually a Last Man novel, of which Mary Shelley wrote the first, or one of her novels called The Last Man, and it's a sort of first in a genre of stories of the last person on Earth after there's been some huge catastrophe, kind of wandering around, hoping to find a friend, another survivor, and encountering whatever catastrophe has befallen the world. So you told me this incredible story of having made the film and then found this novel that matched somehow, and this serendipity, and then producing a book, which was a collection of essays about the film, some stills and other elements of the piece, which you can elaborate if you'd like, and an excerpt from the novel. And as I've developed, I've freed myself from the requirements of academia a little bit, and developed the freedom to write as I like, I've been playing over and over again with how to mobilize in a narrative a series of images, of theoretical interventions, scientific, observations into a story. How to produce that as a story or a narrated set of images that a kind of ekphrasis, as a description of an exhibition or of something one has observed that's compelling enough that one can put oneself into that situation, even if it never actually existed. Maybe all of those objects were never assembled in one place, but if you tell a story as if they were, or narrate environments as if you had been from one place to another, you can kind of produce a world. And eventually I've realized that it's not so novel actually. This is in a way what fiction writers do. It's also what philosophers do when we develop thought experiments and, imagine a possible world in which, there are rats and cats and brains in vats, etc. So I guess I try to do that. That's my biggest struggle, is to produce a kind of coherent world in which a disparate array of images, facts, concerns can be assembled and you can move through them. But I don't know, it's a big struggle actually still. And I'm very inspired by Nadim's writing, which seems to be have a more fluid narrative order to it. So please tell us how you do it.
My first degree was in philosophy, but then I studied art history. But the reason it was by the skin of my teeth that I chose philosophy. I nearly went to art school, but I was tempted away by reading the Futurist Manifesto and the Surrealist Manifesto, and that kind of kicked me towards what I thought they might be philosophy. So I went off to study philosophy. Turned out it wasn't. It was artist writing. But that manifesto form is a kind of constant touchstone for my critical essays. But I would say that there's a whole other there's that manifesto form. It's always an argument, and you trade in ideas, and you kind of marshal them like it's a stick. Like you can poke someone with it, you can hit someone with it, you can fling it. It's philosophizing with a hammer. Like it's in that sense. But after you've done that, and I often think that the exhibitions are kind of writing by other means, or they're argumentation by other means. It's arguing the case. After you've done that, there's always a story to tell. And recently, it's been bothering me so much that, the catalog essay that explains, the sort of conceptual architecture of why I did this really is just the beginning of speaking about what was it like to try and do that. The most interesting journey for the more ambitious projects that I've done has been the sort of all the behind-the-scenes things up until the point where it opens. Like, how do you get anyone to agree to bring you on their boat? To take that journey with you. Like, what is how do you kind of get access to how did you get the keys to the castle? What did it smell like? What does it take to make an exhibition actually in the flesh happen out in the world? And so that's what that book, As We Used to Float, is about. It's about everything but the artwork or the art object. It's everything around the making of sort of a series of images and the argumentation that those images kind of make when arrayed in space or in conversations. And so for the first time I've written a narrative. I would say the difference between me and you is, when you read a lot of history for your, in further study, you encounter narrative more often. And I think that narrative has had a really bad rap in sort of contemporary art and sort of it's narrative painting. But I think there's a kind of a new viability to narrative today that's sort of intriguing me. Or it's another component of these projects.
I want to open it up to the question, because I know we had a slight delayed start this morning, so I do want to wrap it up because I know it's Valentine's Day, and my student, or I was told I'm very mean for hosting something on a Valentine's Day, but I think I'm just more like nature indifferent to it. So, but yes, question.
Speaking of narrative, thanks for both of your projects. Question for Nadine. Your narrative kind of ends with this exhibition, sort of, or the second piece that you commissioned that was the coordinates of this piece, funding the conservation of these sharks, or like that money that was, am I correct?
No, the narrative, as it were, kind of mutates into a story that scientists can tell, perhaps to politicians and policymakers, about what the actual sharks who live there, what their lives are like, where they go, where they've been last month.
Right, but the project's like what your interventions
Yeah.
funded that research, and that kind of knowledge that's being then given to politicians, right?
Yeah, I mean, but and so it's the project is a continuum, as it were, between on the kind of earliest moment this kind of a novel and a kind of historical imaginary buried treasure, through a kind of, if you want, a conceptual art or conceptual curatorial sort of, I don't know, to some degree parlor game, into material and physical sort of science and the things that sort of scientific sort of information can do for the place. And at a certain point, the stories I tell about what this project was as art kind of dissolve into sort of the stories that the scientists can tell about these creatures. And it's absolutely only because that we buried an exhibition. And that's an interesting mutation for me. Where does my voice end as an exhibition maker? Where does the exhibition like literally swim away from me out into the world?
I mean, then my question is that, aren't there, then I start to question the exhibition itself. I mean, if the end point is that, then are there other ways that we can engage in a project like that that would have the same end point without the artistic endeavor? So then get straight to the conservation of sharks and funding those projects.
I don't know, but how do you get straight to the conservation? Like, how do you get the resources together to do it? Like, how? Literally, this was one way in which that happened. And it happened through telling a story about, hiding art. There's the notion that the sort of you get there easily it's never that easy. There's kind of images produced, perhaps by documentary media. There are image regimes that like precede and play midwife to conservation initiatives. And I find it very rare that the kind of image-making project is sort of flows in the way I want it to into these projects. So, yeah. I mean, I'm not a charity fundraiser. It was interesting to me to imagine what it would be to bury artwork and call it an exhibition. Honestly, as much as I care about the sharks, like as much as I'm happy to say that.
I mean, it's hard because the image is there. So.
Did you want to say something?
Thank you.
I could, or
Thank
you
you.
wouldn't take another question.
Any other questions? Yeah, Richard. Can you just pass the mic over? Thanks, Pras.
Well, you wouldn't be able to tell the story about punking the art market, which is really, it's sort of turning that around. So I think it's a big part of that. But I wondered, because I recently visited Arcosanti, and I'd never been there, but I had a book, Paolo Solari's book, as a teenager. It was one of the first books I had about architecture. So when I went there, I found it very disquieting. So I'm wondering what made you and the others, did something when you went there make you uncomfortable?
Many things were unearthed at Arcosanti that became uncomfortable. But initially, maybe I'll just back up to say one thing about this question that you fielded, because it leads me to Arcosanti, which is I think there are sometimes relatively unusual circumstances in which an art or cultural project becomes the stimulus for scientific research or other kinds of more practical or applied research, or getting immediately to conserving the sharks, for example. Provoking, an art exhibition funding a shark conservancy and the scientific research there is interesting. I was quite excited and eager to engage with scientists, even some of whom their research was maybe, suspicious to me. Geoengineering researchers were part of my interlocutors throughout the project. I was excited to collaborate with meteorologists. So when a cultural question can become a provocation for science, I think that's quite interesting. I was based at Arizona State University part of the time in starting this project, as well as in Copenhagen. But I thought, first of all, it would be ideal to locate this initial writers' retreat in the desert, as Arizona is fraught with environmental issues. Phoenix will run out of water already. Airplane wheels melt on the tarmac in summer, etc. So it offered a kind of, broadly speaking, an environment and a landscape that could be provocative. But it's also speckled with crumbling utopias of yesteryear, one of which is Biosphere 2, an insane project started by artists in which they sought to live inside these domes for a period of 2 years. A science project born of an art project and funded initially as an artistic project. For various reasons, Biosphere 2 was not a feasible place to do this project. Arcosanti is beloved by a lot of people in Phoenix. It's nearby, it's cheap, it's weird, it's kind of charming. Sometimes you go and it seems really charming. Other times it seems like an actual wreck. Depends who gives you a tour, etc. But it emerged as a plausible place where we could afford to host a retreat that had been interesting on its own, because Soleri's philosophy, his concept of arcology, has already appeared in science fiction. So there were a lot of practical reasons, but also it resonated somehow with some of the themes that we were taking up in the project. So we went to Arcosanti. I should say that I went several times. We also did a kind of rehearsal dare. The dare, as told by Mary Shelley, the story, involved a kind of camaraderie among friends, eating and drinking and experimenting with the drugs of the day, hearing lectures on the scientific research of the day. And it was that spirit that we were trying to cultivate. So I went with friends who indulged me in reading poetry and kind of playing out what we might do when we went back with the writers and the scientists and the futurists. And then, of course, it was quite different. Many of them didn't drink, for one thing, so that was, always a concern, a constraint on artistic production, potentially. There were many things that we learned during that trip about Arcosanti, also based on who we met. Some more disgruntled participants. I should say it's an experimental town that's still being built. And interestingly, the whole thing purportedly is funded by making these iron bells, which are quite charming, but it's hard to believe that they would keep crazy architectural experiment going for 30 or 40 years, but ostensibly that's how it happens. But it's mostly being built by volunteers, as it has been almost from the beginning. And so looking back, we spent some time in the archives with the archivist, and we learned a lot more about the kind of internal politics of Arcosanti that are still very fraught and kind of visible also in the crumbling infrastructure. That's actually how it came to be that this book, which was taken by an architecture series on Columbia University Press, Columbia Books on Architecture in the City. They took an interest in it because of the staging of this kind of thought experiment at this significant architectural site. So James Graham, one of the authors and the series editor, went back to Arcosanti to do some research and look in the archives, and a wonderful essay was planned. I only learned after he submitted the essay that they almost pulled the book from the series, because maybe I wasn't listening, but it came out last year that Solari had a terrible history of sexually abusing his daughter and perhaps many other people. So there's a very dark history as well to his personal relationships. And what gets excavated a bit in the essay in the book is that maybe that draws our attention not only to that interpersonal and very specific events that happen, which are obviously terrible, but to a kind of totalitarian impulse that was maybe latent in some of his utopian aspirations. And so James, in going back and reading through the archives, he found that there were these utopian aspirations of people who came to Arcosanti trying to build this new city, but there were also frustrations and tensions and concerns being expressed all throughout the process. And I think it's quite instructive, in thinking about what these experiments can be, to look back and kind of excavate the tensions and also really confront them. I was really glad that they didn't just kill the book, but then when we were faced with what to do with this information, it seemed not appropriate to say, oh, well, we just pretend, it's just about his architecture. Because it's not. The stories change, and the significance of the stories, the histories, the artifact change over time. Facts emerge, stories emerge, and I think it's important to give them space. So the significance of Arcosanti changed for the participants or for some of the participants in this project. For others who were not, they weren't really paying attention to architectural history, probably got lost in a slew of similar allegations made by so many significant people, over the last few years. But I think it's significant to capture how the interpersonal and the broader social context and kind of it's one of the layers that is significant to pay attention to, just like Shelley's personal history, in a way, my personal history, my friendships, my loves become embedded in my relationships to places, environments, priorities, values. And I think that's part of why going and actually staring the shark in the eye is produces a very different kind of relation to a place or a problem than just knowing from a distance that, of course, we should take care of sharks. Well, why? Why sharks as opposed to all the other critters that need to be conserved? So I think, just to say a little bit about Arcosanti and its demons. They play a role in the story as well.
Just briefly, I think that I just want to make a note. I think the kind of the vision or the token of a geographical outside or beyond that is an ecological kind of pristine site like Antarctica or like this island. I mean, the kind of cultural valence of these tokens, they're used in all kinds of ways, but when they're used as kind of utopian tokens, as sort of no places, they really kind of obscure, as I said, the kind of functional proximity we have to them, and kind of jumping in the water and being the fly in the ointment in a sense, is kind of a way to sort of just create a conversation about that, because we're all in a space of here we're sort of in an intellectual space, we're broadly a kind of in progressive space, we're in a kind of ecologically minded, we're sort of all of those things, and so that's why we think that one of us would never go and be that fly in the ointment. Why should you go there? Do you really need to be the one, do you need to place your boots on Antarctica to really care about it in a way? I think that these kind of functional proximities, where is the party really happening? Is it really in the palm plantation, the empty rave, or is it in the Oreo? I think we need a bit more of that, and I'm sort of pursuing that too. I think this idea of utopia is now sort of a really sort of questionable sort of project, and
that's what's fascinating about being in Arcosanti, because you're in a failed utopia and you can almost project forward when it's going to be some sort of bizarre ruin, right, or something else, and you feel it very strongly, right, and you have to go there to experience that.
Yeah, it's a cautionary note against
Exactly.
utopian thinking, and yet I think it's still quite important to have that. I mean, the tension in utopian thinking is quite important. Also, as a cautionary note, thinking about solutions to all the problems that we're trying to come with, spray some sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. It's a solution to one problem and comes with others, and most complex problems are like that. So I think it's worth confronting them and airing the dirty laundry and living with it, because it's not, it's pretty hard to escape.
And sure. Across this project, Antarctica and Bikini Atoll, one of the things that struck me most, and one of the things which kind of really sort of pushed me to write this narrative account of my journey to Bikini, is, you get there, you arrive at this place that's, as I said, the good as a geographical figure. It's like, it's everything you hoped it would be. Like, the glaciers are as big as you could ever have hoped to imagine, or the sand is as white and as clean as it should be, the jungle canopy is so verdant and lush. But you're never just standing there, like, in silence on this place. In fact, you arrive on a boat or a ship, which is more or less it's a completely sort of all-encompassing and all-enclosing sort of machine. Like, so you've always exited this rumbling, shaking, vibrating, like steel and iron, like edifice that smells of smoke and belches out fumes at the back end. So you're in there most of the day. Then you go out on shore, and then you take a picture of a glacier, and then you say, look at this glacier, like, take care. But everyone who's ever gone there to take a photo of a glacier has arrived on some godforsaken contraption. And just toggling between, the cabin and, this sort of absolutely oppressive, all sort of totally designed, sort of constructed space, and this other space was really it just became more and more palpable. And so the boat is it's like the spaceship. It's like, it's sort of spaceship Earth, and you see Antarctica out the window. So I think this is where the narrative element comes in, and this is there is, how did you get anywhere? The beautiful mountain's always at the end of a highway, or at the end of an exhaust pipe, or at the end of some collector's inherited wealth, or some evil oligarch, or the government. It's kind of got to work through that trouble. You've got to chase that monster over the ice and figure out if it can lead anywhere productive.
Well, I mean, we just could keep going, but we're definitely over time. So I want to thank our guests this evening, and of course, welcome people to come up and continue the conversation. But let everyone else. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we have a couple of books here. So if people are looking for one, please come up and talk to Delia or myself, and make sure that happens. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
I wanted.
Yeah.